He sat alone in the far corner of the armory sleeves, rolled up hands blackened with carbon, speaking only to the weapons no one else could fix. To most, he was just an old civilian tech, quiet, outdated, maybe even misplaced. Until one afternoon, a Navy SEAL walked in, unslung his custom rifle, and placed it without a word on the old man's bench. The room went silent. Because in a place where trust is earned shot by shot, no SEAL hands over his weapon to a stranger, unless he knows something the rest don't. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from. And if you enjoy this story, don't forget to subscribe. Redstone Armory was a place built on noise. The facility sprawled across a lonely patch of Arizona desert, a fortress of corrugated steel and sun-bleached concrete. Inside, the air was dense with the sharp scent of gun oil solder and red desert dust. Metal clanged against metal as racks of rifles shifted bolts, snapped springs, pinged, and carbide files hissed over stubborn carbon. Above it all, the constant hum of conversation shop talk, Barb's technical debates spilled through the bays like the haze from a badly tuned engine. Somewhere, the ancient radio stuttered out old country songs, barely audible beneath the work. It was a hive, alive, with motion and argument. In one bay, a group hunched over ARs, stripping them bare and arguing over tolerances. In another, techs calibrated optics with laser-level precision, muttering about lens fog and thermal drift. Around the far workbench, a trio tested Frankenstein weapons hybrid modded pieces pieced together from contracts experiments and outright stubbornness. Here, technique was a badge of pride. The work was not just a job, but an ongoing contest. Who could tune a gas system faster, whose fix would hold under 1,000 rounds, who could coax the last ounce of accuracy from a battered barrel. Disputes were part of the culture. You can't run that grease in Arizona. It'll turn to paste before noons, watch me. This barrel will outlast yours by a mile. Zero that optic again, rookie. You're high and left. Blame the heat all you want. Redstone wasn't just a place to maintain weapons. It was a crucible where reputations were forged in steel oil and sweat. But tucked away in the shadowed back corner beyond the main run of benches and the lines of fluorescent light sat a single battered workstation that rarely entered anyone's conversations. There, a solitary man worked surrounded by the detritus. No one else wanted cracked handguards. Battered bolts, receivers pitted with sand and years. James Gunner Maddox looked every bit the outsider. He was about 50, built thick through the shoulders, his forearms corded and speckled with the scars of 100 close calls. His hair was iron gray, threaded with white at the temples, and the Arizona sun had painted deep lines across his face. His eyes, a washed-out blue, seemed too old for the rest of him, sunken steady, and seldom lifted from his work. He wore no badge, no nameplate, not even the standard-issue tech uniform, just a faded flannel shirt, oil dark at the cuffs, with sleeves rolled high. Grease-stained leather gloves worn thin over his knuckles, and a pair of battered safety glasses completed the picture, one lens cracked at the edge, but never replaced. He didn't join the talk. He didn't laugh at the jokes, didn't bother with the radio, didn't drift between benches for quick advice or camaraderie. He kept his space clean, and his tools arranged in a pattern only he seemed to understand. Every so often, the distinct clink of his work would cut through the din, the slow, patient tap of a pin drifting free, the measured click of a bolt, locking home the near-silent brush of an oiled rag across a carrier group. Each movement was deliberate, practiced, never wasted. No one remembered when he had started at Redstone. No one recalled the first day he'd shown up or who had even hired him. He was just there quietly at first, and then it seemed always. People barely noticed. Of course, the void he left in the social atmosphere was quickly filled with speculation. The younger techs liked to whisper theories, each more colorful than the last. Some said Maddox was somebody's guy sent down from HQ on a favor, or kept around for political reasons. One rumor had it that he'd been a personal armorer for a senator, only to be quietly shuffled off after a scandal overseas. Others believed he'd once been a contractor in Afghanistan, or maybe the survivor of a team that didn't make it back patched onto the civilian support list out of guilt or bureaucracy. The older hands were less imaginative, but more pointed. They said Maddox looked like a man who'd been put out to pasture. Maybe he'd been special ops just long enough to get someone important killed, or at least to be the guy everyone wanted to forget. One night in the chow hall, a junior tech said loud enough for half the armory to hear, "That old guy looks like he got kicked off the battlefield and dumped here so nobody'd have to look at him." Nobody bothered to check if it was true. Maddox was a civilian contractor as file, such as it was listed support technician. Not quite staff, not quite outside. His employment paperwork was blurry, like a photo of a ghost. If Maddox ever heard the whispers or noticed the stares, he gave no sign. When someone muttered a dig at his age or his silent routine, he just kept working, face-lowered hands, steady, focused on the task at hand. He never snapped back, never defended himself, never seemed irritated or even aware of the gossip that circled the bays. If anyone tried to involve him, ask for an opinion, invite him to lunch, or toss him a joke, he'd offer nothing. He didn't seek advice, didn't offer his own. He worked in a private universe, each movement perfectly contained. The clamor of redstone faded at the edge of his bench, as if he existed behind a pane of glass. He moved through his day with a kind of self-erasure, the only evidence of his presence left behind in the perfectly reassembled weapons and the stains on his gloves. He rarely left his corner except to use the break room after everyone else had cleared out. He was the last to leave most nights, and the first to arrive each morning, flicking on his own bench light long before the first chorus of country radio or the first argument over lubricant. He didn't ask for special parts, didn't lobby for better hours, didn't volunteer for any job that wasn't left on his bench. His was a discipline of subtraction, removing himself from the chaos and the need for approval. In a place where precision and teamwork were the marks of honor, Maddox stood alone, a solitary craftsman, invisible, but inevitable the exception, who proved the rule. Sometimes someone would ask if the old man was all right back there, buried in work. But the answer always was a shrug. He likes it that way. And Maddox, for his part, made no effort to correct them. He didn't exist for their curiosity. He existed for the next weapon in line, for the next flaw to be coaxed out of battered steel, for the next hours spent in the hush behind the noise. At Redstone Armory, every technician knew which jobs were worth fighting over and which ones weren't. The prime real estate went to those who worked fastest and loudest, the well-oiled rifles, the precision barrels, the high-end optics that only needed a tune-up. But there was another kind of work too. It was the kind that quietly piled up at the edges of the shop-battered weapons, with their stories worn down to the bare metal, their faults so ingrained that no one wanted to claim them. Maddox never volunteered for these jobs. He didn't need to. The failed projects, the ones that wouldn't cycle properly, the ones with mystery jams or catastrophic wear, always ended up on his bench. They drifted there the way stray dogs find the only porch light left burning on a stormy night. An M110 with a misaligned piston assembly, a scar with the bore pitted from years of neglect, a battered old Remington shotgun that refused to feed shells smoothly. One by one, they'd accumulate on his battered bench, left by others who'd shrugged in defeat. Some weapons had been serviced 2-3 times already. Each time another note would be taped to the stock stiff charging handle. Barrel key walking gas rings replaced still short stroking. By the time they reached Maddox, hope had all but drained away. Occasionally, someone would drop off a hopeless case with a smirk, tossing a barb over their shoulder. "Show us a miracle, old man." Maddox never replied. He'd just pull his lamp closer and begin eyes narrowing behind scratched lenses as he worked the gun down to its bones. He didn't rush. He didn't mutter. Piece by piece, Maddox would dismantle each weapon, every movement, slow, precise, and patient as a surgeon. He handled each part with the same care, whether it belonged to a weapon that had seen 5 years in the sandbox or 5 weeks in the hands of a careless recruit. When he worked, the cacophony of redstone faded, leaving only the sound of steel-oiled rag and the occasional low sigh that could have been either from him or from the gun itself. It was a strange thing to witness a man out of time refusing every shortcut of the modern workshop. While younger techs reached for digital calipers, torque wrenches, or laser bore sighters, Maddox relied on the tools he'd carried for decades: a battered steel rule, a collection of picks and scrapers sharpened by hand, a single honest hammer. When inspecting a bolt carrier, he wouldn't trust a dial indicator. Instead, he'd balance it in his palm, spinning it slowly, listening to the whisper of metal on skin. A faint hitch in the rotation, a sound almost too subtle for anyone else to hear, would bring a frown to his lips. Then he'd flip the carrier, run his thumb along the edge, and find a barely perceptible ridge that had caused a cycling failure no one else could pinpoint. For optics, Maddox needed only daylight and a fragment of mesh screen. He'd hold a battered ACOG scope up to the window, using the horizon and the grid to set the reticle true. No high-dollar gadgets, no computers, just light shadow, and the slow, careful adjustment of tension, screws, until the crosshairs sat dead center. One afternoon, a pair of junior techs watched him work on an M4 that had baffled the shop. The rifle shot wide left at 200 yards, despite every fix in the manual. They'd spent an hour recalibrating, testing, and cursing. Maddox listened, shrugged, and asked for the gun. He ran the action twice, field stripped the receiver, then held the barrel up to the light, turning it until something in the rifling caught his eye. He took a rag, wrapped it around a cleaning rod, and after 7 minutes of quiet work, handed the rifle back. "Try it now." It shot straight as a line on glass. A tech once asked, half in awe and half in frustration, "Where'd you learn to do that?" Maddox's answer was as simple as it was heavy. In places where a half-inch off meant someone died. No one had a comeback for that. But the real proof of his skill wasn't just in fixing what was broken. It was in the quiet, incremental improvements he left behind. Changes so subtle you'd never know they were there, unless you knew how a weapon was supposed to feel. After Maddox worked on a gun, the action ran smoother. Triggers were lighter but crisper. The recoil seemed to soak into the stock instead of rattling up through the wrist. He would sometimes swap out factory springs for custom-cut ones tailored to the shooter's preference, tighter or looser, left or right-handed. Once he glued a thin rubber pad inside a wooden stock, and the owner later swore the gun felt softer, but could never figure out why. He didn't write notes or file upgrade lists. There was never any formal documentation, never a request for recognition. The only evidence was in the results. People would walk out to the range with a gun Maddox had fixed, fire a magazine, and pause, frowning in surprise. Did this always run this smooth? But nobody thought to ask who'd made it that way. And Maddox, for his part, would already be on to the next lost cause. The silence around Maddox was matched only by the indifference of the shop. No one paid attention to how he worked or what he fixed. His habits didn't line up with Redstone's army of forms and checklists. He didn't log his repairs, didn't file after-action reports, never sought approval to test-fire the weapons he'd serviced. When asked if a repair was complete, he'd nod or shake his head, rarely giving more than a single word in reply. Some of the staff considered this a kind of quiet insubordination. "Guy's just stubborn," they'd say. "He's old set in his ways, doesn't want the hassle." Others assumed he was hiding incompetence behind a wall of silence, too proud to admit he couldn't keep up. But the truth was neither. Maddox understood that any real explanation, any real conversation might lead to questions he'd spent years avoiding. Questions about where he'd been, what he'd seen, why his hands moved with such certainty around failures others couldn't fathom. The more invisible he made himself, the less likely anyone was to look beyond his bench into the life he lived when the shop lights went out. If anyone had bothered to follow Maddox home, they'd have seen just how far that invisibility extended. He lived alone in a battered wooden cabin, 10 miles out from Redstone, perched at the edge of the mesquite and sand. There was no internet, no cell service, no television. Only a battered generator for power, 2 ancient hunting rifles hanging above the door, and a sagging bed set beside a rusty wood stove. Each morning, he drove an old Chevy Silverado into work, and the paint faded to primer, and the windshield cracked with the memory of 100 desert storms. He always arrived before the rest, the parking lot still empty under the rising sun. At night, he was the last to leave the headlights, carving long, pale scars across the lonely desert road. Inside his cabin, there was a single photo frame face down on the shelf, gathering dust. In it, if someone dared to turn it over, were the faces of his wife and son. He hadn't seen them in nearly 10 years. Maddox had spent a lifetime at war. The year his son graduated high school, Maddox was in Iraq, patching rifles in a makeshift tent outside Fallujah. The day his wife went in for heart surgery, he was in Yemen wiring a satellite phone and hoping the call would go through. When his son enlisted, Maddox only found out months later after a friend from the old days mailed him the news clipping. The last message he'd received from his wife still burned in his mind. "When you choose your family over your rifle, we'll still be a home. Until then, please don't call." He never replied. He knew the truth of it as surely as he knew the cold weight of a steel bolt in his hand. Some choices once made cannot be undone. So Maddox made peace, if you could call it that, with solitude. He poured what was left of his care, his patience, his need to fix what was broken into the machines left to die on his bench. A man can lose everything and still have a purpose, he told himself. Sometimes that purpose is small and sharp and silent, a click, a sigh, a gun that runs as it should in a world where so little else does. He never talked about his family. He never hinted at regret, never mentioned love, never tried to explain the distance he kept from everyone, even himself. Instead, each day became a private act of penance. He showed up, fixed what others threw away, and left before anyone could thank him. The world, as far as Maddox was concerned, owed him nothing. But for every rifle that fired true, every shotgun that cycled clean, every battered old weapon that found its way home in working order, he felt perhaps something like grace. And that, in the end, was enough. The change in atmosphere was instant. The first rays of dawn were still chasing shadows across the runway when the big C-17 set down, kicking up a swirl of dust across the tarmac. Within minutes, the unmistakable presence of SEAL Team 6 swept through Redstone Armory like a dry wind off the Arizona plateau. The jokes and banter that had marked the overnight shift died quickly, replaced by a taut sense of purpose. Nervous, sharp, no margin for error. They came in fast, men and women, in battered ball caps and faded uniforms, their faces sunburned and unreadable, their movements precise and quick. Every technician on the floor stood a little straighter, speaking in lower tones. The arrival of SEALs was never routine. Where regular units might treat the armory like a pit stop, these operators moved with a kind of edge that came only from having seen the line between mistake and catastrophe. For the younger techs, it was a mixture of awe and anxiety. Everyone wanted a shot at working on SEAL gear, the challenge, the reputation, the whispered possibility that your name would be mentioned in after-action reports. But no one wanted to be the one who missed a cracked gas ring or failed to tighten a rail just right. For these operators, weapons weren't just tools. They were extensions of muscle reflex and memory, each mod, each adjustment a story written in sweat and risk. No two rifles were alike. Every carbine, every sidearm bore the signature of a dozen tweaks and field repairs customized for a specific hand, a specific job, a specific nightmare. A lieutenant in the SEAL team, his face unreadable behind mirrored Oakleys, produced a dog-eared list and handed it to the shop supervisor. 17 units, he said. Full diagnostic recalibration and pressure testing. 72 hours. He glanced up. If anything isn't right, don't sign off. We'll check everything on the range before we go. No exceptions. The list was a parade of heavy hitters, suppressed carbines with custom triggers, sniper rifles with heat-treated barrels, optics built to survive a sandstorm. Some guns bore the fingerprints of years of hard use. Others gleamed with the chill edge of new modifications, Trigicon ACOGN, with hand-etched reticle suppressors scorched by more than one midnight op trigger groups rebuilt so many times they'd never pass an armory inspection anywhere else. As the weapons came in, each one was logged, tagged, and divided up among the tech teams. The usual friendly competition faded to a hush of meticulous checklists and nervous double-checking. Mistakes here could cost more than just pride. The pressure was heightened by the mission itself. The SEALs were deploying south into Baja, an unforgiving stretch of Mexican desert, where nothing survived except the quick, the prepared, and the lucky. The environment was the kind that turned even the best equipment into liabilities if you weren't careful. Everything about Baja was extreme. The heat in the day could warp a barrel, the night cold would snap plastic like a cracker, and the air itself carried sand so fine it could worm its way past O-rings and seals choking a buffer tube or fouling a gas port. Electronics were notorious for dying in the field circuit boards, shorted by sudden humidity sensors fogged or frozen by the wild swings in temperature between dusk and dawn. Even the best-maintained weapon could go sideways after a few hours outside. The entire armory felt the pressure. Every rifle needed its bolt pull, measured, every seal rechecked. Lubricants had to be tested against both heat and dust. Barrels and chambers were cleaned, dried, and then treated with moisture inhibitors. The task was exhaustive and exhausting. Teams of techs worked in small groups, each assigned 3 to 5 weapons, working through checklists in near silence. But among all the weapons, there was one that didn't fit the list. It wasn't on the manifest or the official inspection roster. Instead, it arrived in the hands of a SEAL whose name no one knew, with no paperwork and no explanation, just a single well-traveled rifle slung carelessly over one shoulder. The weapon was a Mk-18 Mod 1, but it might as well have been a legend. The modifications were obvious, even at a glance: hand-cut suppressor rail system, reinforced with non-standard bolts, a piston assembly that no tech in the shop could identify. It had been run hard in environments the others only read about in training, but it also bore the scars of neglect, evidence of long deployments on salt-soaked boats, days of action followed by too few hours on the cleaning rack. Its owner, tall, silent eyes hidden behind dark sunglasses, laid it down at the edge of a workbench and spoke just loud enough to be heard. "If you can't fix it, don't touch it. I'll take it with me if it's not right." When the bolt carrier was finally pulled, the problem was clear and ugly. Years of carbon had baked into the system, forming a black crystalline crust that defeated every solvent and tool the staff could bring to bear. The carbon wasn't just dirty, it was bonded fused like a stone inside the action. Someone tried a brass scraper and snapped the tip. Another tech ran a flexible bore snake through the barrel, only to have it seize up and snap off. After a half hour of unsuccessful attempts, the lead armorer, an old hand with 2 decades experience and little patience for impossible jobs, shook his head. "If you want that clean, you'll have to break down the whole gas system. Risk trashing the alignment, maybe bust a fitting. And we don't have spare parts for half those mods. Not touching it. He placed the rifle to one side, marking it with a strip of red tape. Unsafe owner to review. For a moment, the weapon sat at the edge of the workspace like an accusation, a reminder of the limits of even the most skilled techs. Nobody wanted to be the one to try and fail next. It was too easy to make things worse. The SEAL who brought it in watched all this without blinking. When told the news, he just nodded once, picked up his helmet, and delivered a single line over his shoulder as he turned to go. "If you can't fix it, I'll take it as is. I trust my own hands more than yours." The challenge hung in the air long after he left. For a while, the rifle sat ignored. The techs resumed their routines, relieved to have passed off the problem. The red tape was a shield permission to do nothing, an official sign that some jobs were simply too risky. Maddox watched all this from the far end of the shop. He hadn't spoken during the huddle, hadn't volunteered advice. He never did. Instead, he watched the procession, the careful attempts, the mounting frustration, the eventual surrender. He watched the way the younger men avoided meeting each other's eyes, the way the lead armorer tapped his pen in frustration, and the way the SEAL's rifle was finally set aside like yesterday's bad news. He waited until the buzz had faded, until the laughter and commentary had given way to the low thrum of work. Then, wordless as ever, he stood and crossed to the abandoned MK-18. He pressed his hand along the length of the barrel, feeling for heat, for tension, for the subtle flex that meant trouble deep inside. He turned it over, let his thumb run the underside of the rail, noting the non-standard bolts and the scratch marks left by field repairs done in a hurry. He flicked the safety, feeling the grit in the mechanism. He tilted the stock against his palm, feeling the balance, the recoil pad weight distributed for someone taller, left-eye dominant. He did not speak. He did not ask permission. He simply picked up the rifle, nodded once to himself, and carried it back to his station. No one stopped him. No one expected anything. A couple of junior techs snickered under their breath as he passed, guessed the old man's feeling brave today. Probably thinks it's a .22 rimfire from back in the Cold War. A few more chuckled, not with cruelty, but with the certainty of those who had seen enough failure to predict it coming. But Maddox didn't hear them. Or if he did, he gave no sign. He set the MK-18 on his bench, switched on his lamp, and bent over the battered steel as if it were just another lost thing, another broken puzzle the world had given up on. In that moment, the laughter faded, replaced by the steady, purposeful sound of a man at work, the one kind of noise no one ever mocked, because deep down they all knew. The desert demanded more than just skill. And sometimes the best answer wasn't in the manual, but in the silent hands of the one person nobody truly knew. Not everyone in Redstone's armory was the same, no matter how similar the uniforms looked, or how easily people blended into the shop's clamor. When Petty Officer First Class Nate Jackson entered the armory that morning, there was a shift one you could feel more than see, as if the barometric pressure dropped or the music on the radio hit a different, sharper note. Jackson was one of the most experienced SEALs in the group, a veteran of operations from Syria to the Horn of Africa. He'd been in and out of teams longer than most of the techs had been alive. He moved with an economy of motion, not wasting a single gesture, and he wore the seriousness of his profession like a second skin. His reputation for precision was legendary, especially when it came to his gear. There was one standing rule among his teammates. No one touched Jackson's personal HK-416. It was his signature weapon, hand-fitted and tuned by his own hand, adjusted for the way he moved and the way he fought. Even the armory's best armorers didn't so much as glance at it. To Jackson, a rifle was as personal as a heartbeat. That morning, Jackson's gaze swept the armory like a searchlight. Most people barely registered him. A few offered a respectful nod, careful not to get in his way. He scanned the benches, noting the weapons, the clusters of techs, the piles of parts and tools. But it was the figure in the far corner, half in shadow, hunched over a battered Mk-18 that drew his attention. While others joked or busied themselves, Jackson stilled his focus, settling on the old man the way a tracker might pause at a single, unfamiliar print in the dust. He didn't join the laughter. He didn't watch the techs wrestling with their checklists. He simply observed. Jackson was no stranger to the process of repair. He'd learned to strip and rebuild rifles in the field, with little more than a multi-tool and a length of wire. But watching Maddox work was something else entirely. The old man's hands moved with an assurance born of decades, but there was nothing rote or automatic about the way he approached the battered Mk-18. He didn't fumble with manuals or double-check diagrams. He reached instinctively for tools that at first glance looked like they belonged in a watchmaker's kit rather than an armory. A slim bent pick here, a homemade probe there. Each instrument bore the unmistakable polish of long use. As Maddox worked, his movements were deliberate, unscrewing a bolt with his pinky, pivoting a pivot pin with the pad of his thumb, flicking a fragment of carbon away with a gentle snap of his finger. When he came to the deepest blockage, a wedge of blackened carbon fused tight in the gas piston. Maddox didn't curse or call for extra solvent. He simply set the rifle down, placed his left hand flat across the gas tube, and tapped out a measured rhythm with the butt of a screwdriver. Jackson's eyes narrowed. The sound, soft, controlled, steady, brought back memories, nights in muddy tents, a trusted armorer hunched over a rifle. The silence broken only by a careful, methodical knock. It was a sound you never heard in training, but learned to trust in the field. After 3 taps, Maddox chose a slender, curved scraper from his kit, one he'd ground down from some long-forgotten tool. He angled it under the carbon, moving with such delicacy that even the steel seemed to sigh in relief. The carbon fractured, lifting away in one piece. Maddox didn't smile, didn't nod in satisfaction. He just kept working. Every detail attended to laying a cloth beneath the barrel, rolling the rifle to check the chamber, glancing at the buffer spring with a surgeon's frown. The way he handled the weapon told its own story. Jackson had seen men work with that kind of intensity in only a handful of places, Fallujah, Kandahar, corners of the world, where a jammed bolt or a split extractor could mean the end of a mission and the loss of friends. Maddox worked like a man who'd lost too much to ever take a shortcut. After several minutes, Jackson moved closer. He didn't interrupt, didn't announce himself, just drew within a few feet, the better to study Maddox's face and hands. The old man was lost in the work, his eyes never leaving the steel. When Jackson finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, pitched just for Maddox's ears. "You've done this before, haven't you?" There was no accusation in the words, no hint of skepticism, just the quiet recognition of one craftsman to another. Maddox didn't look up. He didn't stop, his fingers still working a stubborn screw. His reply floated out quiet and unembellished, as if the words themselves belonged to the steel a few times. It was not false modesty. It was not a joke. It was a simple, heavy truth, one Jackson recognized at once. He watched a moment longer, searching for the faintest sign of pretense or performance, but found none. The old man's hands never faltered. His posture, his silence, his total immersion, these things could not be faked. Jackson gave a slight nod, almost invisible, and stepped back, letting the moment settle. 3 minutes later, something shifted in the room. Jackson returned to his own corner, his footsteps quiet but sure. He opened his field bag, pulling out the most sacred thing he owned, his HK-416, the rifle. No one but he had touched in 7 years. He cradled it for a second, running his thumb along the receiver, feeling the familiar marks left by hundreds of operations, the wear along the bolt, catch the faint scrape, where a round had once jammed in the Sudanese sand. He hesitated, not from doubt, but from respect, the kind of pause a man gives before handing over the keys to a house he's built by hand, nail by nail. Then, without a word, Jackson crossed back to Maddox's bench. He didn't seek anyone's permission. He didn't announce his decision to the shop or ask the supervisor for approval. He set the HK-416 down right where Maddox had just finished cleaning the table with a swipe of his rag. His voice when he spoke was clear and strong, carrying across the armory without a hint of drama. Let him work. For a split second, the room was frozen. The normal noise of clattering tools, low conversation, and hissing compressors faded into a tense, watchful silence. You could almost hear the click of a safety being disengaged, the quiet inhale of a dozen onlookers. A tech near the back muttered, not quite loud enough to be a challenge, "What the hell's going on?" Another, younger and less certain, shook his head and whispered, "He must be joking. Nobody lets another man touch that rifle, not Jackson. Not ever." But Jackson didn't laugh, didn't explain. He simply stood there, arms folded, his gaze unwavering. His confidence was unspoken, but absolute, a silent dare to anyone who questioned his judgment. Maddox glanced up, meeting Jackson's eyes for the first time. There was an understanding that needed no words, not a transfer of authority, but an exchange of trust. Maddox didn't rush. He took the HK-416 from the table, Jackson's most personal weapon, a machine trusted with his life, and cradled it as if he were greeting an old friend. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed their reflection dull on the battered metal, but Maddox barely seemed to notice. Instead, he placed his left hand flat across the upper receiver and simply closed his eyes. He didn't need to see to know what the rifle was telling him. The pads of his fingers mapped the surface, feeling for every tiny imperfection, every whisper of stress, where metal met metal. Slowly, his right hand traced the edge of the gas block, the spot that always seemed to carry the memory of pressure, heat, and 1,000 silent cycles. He paused, letting his fingertip linger over a seam most wouldn't even notice. Then gently, Maddox tapped the steel with his nail, just a feather-light touch, barely enough to make a sound. But to his ears, the faint tack that answered was all he needed. He tilted his head, listening for the resonance, for the change in tone that spoke of a flaw so subtle it could slip by even the best digital test equipment. Out on the battlefield, he'd learned the hard way. A strange echo in the bolt, a vibration where there should be none, was the kind of warning you only got once. He opened his eyes, voice low, almost as if he were talking to the rifle itself. "Left side," he murmured, not even half an inch out. Across the armory, the atmosphere was electric, the silence brittle as glass. No one wanted to break the spell, not even those who doubted the old man's skill. A junior tech started to offer a tool. "You want the gauge, or..." But his partner grabbed his elbow, shaking his head. "Just watch," he whispered, voice barely above a breath. Jackson stood motionless, arms folded, eyes never leaving his rifle. The night shift supervisor, making his rounds, paused in the doorway. He took in the sight, an old man, no badge, no rank, working bare-handed on a rifle that had been off limits for years. Even he didn't speak. For a few minutes, it was as though the rest of the shop faded away. The only sounds were the hush of cloth over steel, the faint pop as a spring was tested, and the muted click as Maddox cycled the bolt by feel, judging its tension not by numbers, but by instinct. He didn't follow the standard teardown process. There was no ceremonial disassembly, no laying out of parts like trophies. Instead, Maddox worked with surgical economy, cracking open only what needed attention, removing the piston with a gentle twist, checking each spring, each buffer, his movements so careful that even the smallest parts seemed to slip naturally into their places. He reached for a tiny curved tool, one he'd fashioned himself from an old screwdriver, worn to a sheen that bespoke decades of use. He inserted it with care into the gas system, gently prying at the obstruction, listening for the click that would confirm success. To anyone else, the steps would have seemed random, maybe even reckless. But those who watched closely saw something deeper. Every action was deliberate, every movement born of experience so deep it had become instinct. It was as if the rifle itself was cooperating, its pieces falling into line at the touch of someone who truly understood. A young tech, barely out of school, leaned over to his neighbor and whispered, "He doesn't use a scope. He doesn't even need a micrometer. But somehow, he always gets it right." The other shrugged. "He hears what we have to measure." Maddox finished by reaching inside the trigger housing and adjusting the tension screw, a move most would never attempt without a full bench test. But he spun it just 1/8 of a turn, his pinky resting on the metal, feeling for the tiniest shift in resistance. It was the kind of adjustment only someone who'd spent years in real-world firefights would dare make by touch alone. 10 minutes passed, and the work was done. Maddox gave the rifle a final once-over, wiping it down with a clean rag, checking for oil or residue. He didn't bother with a visual inspection, didn't log anything in a book, didn't call for a supervisor's sign-off. Instead, he stood carrying the HK-416 across the aisle and laid it gently on the edge of Jackson's bench. He said nothing, not a word of explanation, not a hint of pride or challenge. He simply turned away, returning to his own work where a battered carbine awaited attention. Jackson watched the corner of his mouth tightening in what might have been a smile. He picked up the rifle, cycling it once, checking the action, feeling the difference in the way the bolt slid and locked. He didn't say thank you. He didn't need to. In military life, there are rituals of gratitude so subtle they're almost invisible. To hand someone your weapon is to trust them with your life. To take it back, no questions, is to accept that trust fully repaid. Later, in the quiet corners of the armory, people would whisper about what they'd seen. "I've never watched anyone fix a gun so fast," one said, shaking his head and without a single misstep. Another, a senior tech who'd seen more than most, offered, "I don't know who that guy really is, but I'd bet my next paycheck he's patched up more rifles under fire than the rest of us put together." For those who'd witnessed it, the image stuck. The old man laying down a rifle, then turning away, asking nothing in return. There was nothing legendary about it. No heroics, no grandstanding, not even the pretense of humility. It was honest, raw, and absolutely real. What Maddox left behind in that moment wasn't just a fixed rifle. It was a lesson in faith, a reminder that sometimes you don't need to see to know what's broken, and you don't need to explain to prove you can heal what others can't. In a world full of noise and competition, he had shown with the quietest touch what mastery and trust could look like. And as the armory returned to its routine, the echo of that silence lingered, a hush that wasn't emptiness, but respect. Master Sergeant Don Briggs had never trusted coincidences. With almost 23 years in the Army, most of them spent running maintenance bays, armories, and logistics rooms across half a dozen continents, he developed a sixth sense for patterns and a sharp eye for what didn't belong. Paperwork was never just paperwork to him. It was a map, a story, a subtle trail of breadcrumbs that always inevitably led somewhere. Briggs ran the technical operations at Redstone and oversaw every file, every piece of gear, every new hire and contract worker that crossed his domain. He'd seen rookies lie about combat experience, officers fudge clearance levels, and contractors slide in on the backs of favors or political connections. Normally, he could tell at a glance where someone came from, what school they'd trained at, who'd signed off on their credentials, what unit had sent them along. But something about Maddox had set off alarm bells from the start. The way the man drifted in each day, never late, never early, never eager, never stalling. He'd watched Maddox handle the most complicated repairs with silent competence, had seen him work alone, while the rest of the text clustered together for advice, shortcuts, or simply comfort in numbers. But it was what happened after Maddox repaired Jackson's rifle that truly gnawed at Briggs. He'd watched from a distance, arms crossed, not saying a word, as the entire room seemed to pause and recalibrate itself around the old man. The work had been too precise, too fast, too quietly confident. Either Maddox was a once-in-a-generation self-taught genius, or he was something much rarer, a ghost trained in places that never left a paper trail. That night, after the armory had cleared out and the lights had dimmed, Briggs found himself sitting at his desk, fingers hovering over his keyboard. He opened the secure access portal, punched in his credentials, and waited for the secondary authentication prompt. He was deep into the restricted personnel records now, where files were protected behind double walls of clearance and oversight territory, reserved for those who'd brushed up against the black edges of special programs. He told himself it was just a routine check, nothing more. But as the system pinged, he felt the same slow, heavy certainty he'd felt a dozen times before. Something here didn't add up. The first page of Maddox's file was a masterpiece of obfuscation. James Maddox, Civilian Support Technician, Armory Contract. No record of basic combat training. No list of schools, no Fort Lee, no Crane, no Quantico. Nothing to indicate formal military weapons tech schooling or even the most basic federal contractor certifications. Instead, a few cold facts: internal access code, Tier 3 clearance normally reserved for highly sensitive material handlers or personnel with direct exposure to compartmentalized projects. Facility access logs showing visits not just to Redstone, but to storage depots and weapons caches in places like New Mexico, Nevada, even Somalia and Djibouti. Briggs scrolled looking for a familiar name, a recommendation, a chain of command. All he found was a single cryptic line, buried near the bottom of the first page: restricted access override. Granted. Review by JSOS Liaison. Approved. He stared at it, frowning. JSOC, the Joint Special Operations Command, didn't hand out overrides for maintenance techs. Only people brought in through very particular channels got that kind of rubber stamp. He leaned back, thinking. Who had called this guy in? Who had pulled those strings? Briggs scanned the history log, a short list of assignments and restricted sites, each with a data mission code, but never a name or a supervisor. It was as if Maddox had drifted through the world like a shadow, leaving just enough of a trace to prove he'd existed, but never enough for anyone to really know who he was. It was the last page that stopped him cold. There, under the triple encrypted section reserved for only the highest level readers, was a single entry: former field armorer. DevGru. Status classified. Extended field status. Retirement type not discharged. Briggs's breath caught. DevGru's SEAL Team 6 wasn't something you found on the usual rosters. There were only a handful of designators that ever appeared in records, sometimes ST6, sometimes a code like B63. And everyone in the world of military tech knew what those codes meant. He'd known a few techs who'd worked alongside special operations units, guys who'd gotten their hands dirty on compartmented gear, maybe even patched up a rifle or two for a Tier 1 operator. But DevGru, that was different. That was the final line, the edge of the map, the jobs that didn't exist outside, whispered conversations and coded transmissions. No one left DevGru and went back to being a civilian. At least, not in any normal sense. Extended field status was a phrase he'd seen only once before, in a file so redacted, the only thing left was the page number. It meant a person was technically retired off the books for command purposes, but still under special scrutiny, still on call, still under obligation if the right code word came down. And not discharged, that was the deepest cut of all. It meant Maddox had never really been released, not truly. He was a ghost, still in the system, not quite in or out. He'd be invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. Briggs exhaled, rubbing his temples. He's still on the rolls, he muttered. But he doesn't belong to anyone. For a moment, Briggs let the silence fill the room. The glow of the monitor flickered over stacks of files. Order forms a mug of stale coffee. He remembered stories half told in distant corners of old bases about DevGru field armorers techs who didn't just fix rifles, but designed them, modified them on the fly, and sometimes followed teams into the field patching up weapons in the back of a Blackhawk or a dirt floor shed in the middle of nowhere. These men had to know more than schematics. They had to understand how a weapon would perform for each individual shooter in each environment under each kind of stress. Their hands were the last to touch the rifle, before it went out sometimes, before it was used to save a life, sometimes before it changed the course of an entire operation. They were the first to know when something had failed, and the last to admit it, even to themselves. Nobody ever gave them awards. Their names weren't written on plaques. But if you listened, if you paid attention, you'd see traces the way a rifle ran smoother than it should, or the way a team walked out of hell because a weapon hadn't failed not even once. If Maddox was one of them. Briggs shivered. What was he doing here at Redstone cleaning guns, like it was just another Tuesday? There were only two possibilities. Either Maddox was making amends for something he couldn't let go, or he was waiting for an order, a call, a reckoning that still hadn't come. Briggs closed the file and pulled his access card from the reader. He got up feeling suddenly older, the weight of secrets pressing against his shoulders. As he walked out of his office, one of the techs glanced up. "Everything okay?" Sarge Briggs hesitated, then offered the faintest smile. "Yeah, everything's fine. Just let him work." But in his eyes, something had changed, a glint of respect, of wariness, of understanding. From that day forward, no one questioned Maddox's place. Not because they knew his story, but because Briggs did. And sometimes that was all the permission anyone needed. There are names you'll never see in after-action reports, nor in the glowing citations handed out at Pentagon ceremonies. Instead, they get whispered in corridors, mumbled over spare parts in the back of armories, or spoken in a hush when someone picks up a rifle with a scar it shouldn't have. Fallujah 2008 was one of those names. To those who'd been there, or who had known someone who hadn't come back, it was more than a place. It was a wound that never quite healed, a point in time when things went sideways and stayed that way. The story never told the same. Twice went something like this: a joint SEAL raid, two teams moving in the pre-dawn haze, targeting an Al-Qaeda commander who'd slipped through every net thrown over Iraq. The weather had shifted that week. Brutal bone-dry heat, a shimmer in the air that warped vision and twisted even the best-laid plans. The rifles that day, mostly MK-18s, tweaked for the mission field. Modified in ways only operators would recognize, should have been up to the task. But as the teams hit the breach, something was off. The first burst of fire sounded wrong, choppy, irregular hesitation where there should have been certainty. Later, in fragments of retelling, it came out gas systems, choked under the strain of heat and dust. A handful of rifles jammed after the opening volley bolts, refusing to cycle. In seconds, the element of surprise turned into a desperate defense. The enemy was waiting. The ambush was swift and merciless. When the sun rose over that stretch of ruined city, only 3 men were still breathing out of 14 who'd gone in. There was no press, no public inquiry, just an internal memo dry as sand, possible failure in gas seal integrity, and suppressor-induced back pressure in weapon systems. At the bottom, in the smallest type, a line that might as well have been written in blood field armorer of record Maddox James. No charges were filed. There was no official debrief, no tribunal, not even a reprimand. But Maddox knew, maybe before anyone else, that there were debts you couldn't pay off with paperwork. He wasn't interrogated, wasn't accused. No one came for him with blame. But he carried it all the same. He understood, as every true armorer does, that to repair weapons wasn't just about function, it was about trust. To hand a rifle back to a man about to cross the wire was to say, "I did everything right. This won't let you down." On that day, something had let them down. Later, one of the survivors cornered Maddox outside a hangar. The man was still healing, face shadowed by loss. "It wasn't your fault," he said, voice ragged. "We all knew the suppressors were overdue for swap. Heat killed the gas system, not you." But Maddox didn't answer. He didn't argue or try to explain. He never did. There was no solace in technicalities or excuses. When he came home, he signed himself out of the unit without fanfare. There was no ceremony, no folded flag. He filed for civilian reassignment armory support, the quietest job he could find, his request stamped without delay. One day he was a name on a list. The next he was gone, vanished from the rolls, a ghost among the living. While Maddox was surviving Fallujah, his wife Karen was fighting her own battle in a hospital 3 time zones away. The news hadn't reached him. He was on radio silence, prepping gear, double-checking firing pins and springs that would in the end prove so fragile. Their son Ethan, 17 and barely grown, tried to reach him. "Dad, you have to come home. Mom's scared. She needs you." But Maddox was already on a transport prepping for the mission. He didn't answer. Instead, he sent back a message he'd typed 100 times before. "On duty. Will call when I can." 10 days later, after the dust of Fallujah had settled and Maddox returned to a world that didn't quite fit anymore, he switched his phone on for the first time since the op. The last message from Karen was still there. "If you can't come back for your family, don't call again." Attached was a photo of Ethan, tall and silent, in a graduation gown Maddox had never seen in person. He didn't reply, didn't try to explain. He understood in his bones a man could keep his team alive or keep his family whole, but he couldn't do both. And he had made his choice. He settled in Arizona because it was empty, because no one cared about his name or what he'd left behind. He signed a civilian contract with the clause, "No former unit listed." He asked for the smallest cabin on the edge of the training range, a space no one visited except to deliver supplies. Each morning before sunrise, Maddox drove the cracked roads into Redstone parking before anyone else arrived. He took the first job on the rack and worked at 1 weapon a day, never more, never less. The only rule he followed was his own: fix it completely or not at all. He didn't ask for extra shifts, didn't push for a raise, didn't volunteer for special assignments. He never brought up ideas for process improvement, never asked to train the younger techs. He didn't join the others for breakfast or linger at the vending machine for talk. One day a supervisor asked him, half joking, "With those hands, Maddox, why not open your own shop? You'd make a killing." Maddox only shook his head. "I don't do this for the money," he said. "I do it because people died when their weapons didn't work." There was a pause long enough for the words to land. He never said he was sorry. He never asked forgiveness. That would have implied he believed he deserved it. There were rumors about Maddox whispered in the corners of the armory when new recruits wanted to know why the old man worked alone. Guys like him, someone always said, they're the last of their kind. Not the best because they're the fastest, but because they're still standing. He didn't share stories. He didn't brag about campaigns or claim credit for saves no one else saw. His hands did all the talking, moving over each battered rifle, as if each was a broken bone in his own body. He never watched a man walk out with a weapon he'd repaired. He'd learned that lesson the hard way, watching through sand-caked goggles as brothers who joked over morning coffee were zipped into bags before noon. Now, when someone shouldered a fixed rifle and headed for the range, Maddox simply turned back to his tools. Sometimes, a young private not yet dulled by war would ask, "Where'd you serve, old man?" Maddox would glance up the lines in his face, deepening, then answer in a voice as dry as the desert. "I stood in places where, if your rifle jammed, the last thing you heard was your buddy breathing beside you." Then, with brutal precision, he'd tighten the gas block half a turn, no more, no less, before moving on to the next gun. There was a quiet pact, unspoken but universally understood in the armory after that. Maddox's silence was not to be broken. He was allowed to do his work one rifle at a time, one ghost exercised for each weapon returned to working order. No one asked for war stories, and no one offered sympathy. If there was a lesson, it was not found in speeches or slogans. It was in the way Maddox repaired what others had given up on, and in the way he never looked back when a job was done. The silence he carried was not emptiness. It was memory, and it was mercy. No one received an official announcement. There was no memo, no schedule posted, no clatter of construction in the night. Yet come Monday morning, as the early light crept across the armory floor and the first technicians drifted in, something was different in the corner where Maddox always sat. It was subtle at first, a new silhouette in the shadows, the scent of fresh wood barely cutting through the old perfume of gun oil and metal. Someone flipped on the overheads, and the surprise became clear: a gun rack, but not the standard issue aluminum ones mounted all along the walls. This was handmade, hewn from deep dark walnut, set firmly in place with heavy military-grade bolts. The surface was smooth, each edge rounded by hand, and not machine-bearing faint tool marks that told of careful carving rather than mass production. In the center, resting with solemn finality, was Jackson's HK-416, the same rifle that had just a week ago shifted the course of everything. It was mounted not to be drawn or fired, not for demonstration or show. Instead, it occupied the center of the rack with an air of permanence, like a memory placed behind glass. No one said who had installed the rack or how it had appeared overnight. No one even admitted to seeing it arrive. Yet there it was, unmistakable, set precisely in the spot where Maddox worked every day. A silent monument, as if the room itself had chosen to mark the moment when something invisible turned to something lasting. There was no nameplate, no glowing inscription, no medals or commendations hanging from the wood. Just beneath the barrel, affixed to the surface, was a small rectangle of brass, no larger than a man's thumb, unpolished and free of ornamentation. In its center, cut deep and thin by a laser, were 3 words: "Let him work." No signature, no explanation of who him was, no flowery message about sacrifice or duty. But everyone who'd spent more than a day in Redstone's armory knew exactly what the words meant. It was Jackson's rifle, legendary in its own right, and now a fixture no longer for battle, but for memory. It was Maddox's hands that had restored it, not for glory, but out of obligation, deeper than words. A young technician stopping in front of the rack murmured softly to his partner, "It's not a tribute, it's a reminder. Anyone smart enough will get it." No one argued. No one added a word. The message hung in the air, understood more in silence than it ever could be in speech. That Monday, as always, Maddox arrived before dawn. He saw the rack, the rifle, the unadorned plaque. But if he felt anything, he didn't show it. He set down his old canvas tool bag, scrubbed his hands in the sink, and clicked on his lamp. He didn't ask where the rack had come from or why his corner had become a place of quiet reverence. If he noticed the way the other techs stood back a little further, or the way no one set their gear on his table anymore, he said nothing. But something had changed. Gone were the nicknames, the eye-rolling, the snickers when Maddox picked up a broken gun from the discard pile. No one called him the old man now or joked about his habits. The shop's greetings were quieter, a nod, a flicker of acknowledgement as he passed. The silence had shifted. It was no longer the apathy of those who didn't care. It had become the deep, wordless respect of people who finally understood what they were witnessing. One afternoon, as the shift changed, a young tech leaned in and whispered to a friend, "Maddox doesn't need a nameplate, doesn't need to be the boss. But now, this whole armory stands behind him." There was no dissent, no debate. If Maddox heard the words, he never let on. No sign forbade touching the rifle. There was no lock on the rack, no chain or alarm, no need for a watchful eye. Yet no one approached. No one so much as brushed against the stock or checked the serial number or asked why it was there. It wasn't out of fear and it wasn't out of superstition. It was simply a boundary everyone understood, instinctively, a place and a thing that belonged to a story bigger than any one of them. When a new recruit cycled into the armory, wide-eyed and eager, the veterans would point at the walnut rack and say, "That's the one thing in here the government doesn't own." No further explanation. No story about Jackson. No tales about Fallujah, about broken rifles and broken men. If the rookie was smart, if he listened and watched and didn't rush to fill the silence, he'd understand. The deepest respect wasn't found in medals or speeches. It was in letting someone do what they did best, undisturbed, for as long as the work needed doing. For Maddox, the legacy was not a rack or a plaque. It was in the work, one rifle at a time, day after day, fixing what others couldn't or wouldn't, without asking for thanks or recognition. For the rest of the team, it was a lesson that a man could atone not by apologizing, but by showing up, by giving everything he had to the thing that had once broken him and making it right for someone else. The rack became a kind of touchstone. When the pressure was high, when the SEALs brought in gear after weeks in the dust, when a mission loomed and nerves frayed, someone would glance at the corner and remember, "Let him work." It wasn't a slogan or an order or even advice. It was simply the truth sometimes. The best thing you can do is step back and trust the quietest man in the room to do what needs to be done. And so Redstone's armory became a different place. Not just for Maddox, but for everyone who walked its halls. The silence that once had been cold and empty now brimmed with respect, history, and the understanding that some kinds of excellence could only be witnessed, never forced or faked. In that silence, a legacy took root, not in words, not in ceremony, but in the quiet, unstoppable work of a man who needed nothing but a rifle, a bench, and the chance to fix what was broken. Maddox's life at Redstone followed the same ritual as ever. He still arrived before the sun had fully broken the horizon, the parking lot little more than a patch of pale dust beneath a big, silent sky. He still left last, the armory's harsh lights already dimmed his silhouette, the final one to pass through the double doors at night. He didn't change his habits for anyone. No assistant fetched tools for him. He never asked anyone to pass a rag or a bottle of oil. He never glanced at the digital test rigs, never checked off boxes on a maintenance checklist tacked to the wall. Instead, he worked by the glow of an old desk lamp with a battered wooden toolbox and a small spiral-bound notebook filled with pencil sketches and notations only he could decipher. For all that, everyone at Redstone saw him differently now. The old crank, the strange holdover from some forgotten era, those whispers had vanished, replaced by a deference that was neither forced nor awkward. If a rifle came in with an inexplicable jam, a pattern of misfires that left even the senior techs stumped, no one hesitated. They carried it to Maddox's station and set it down quietly, like a patient placed before a doctor in the dead of night. They didn't ask him to take it. They didn't plead for his help. They just waited. Maddox never said yes, never made promises. He would inspect the gun, running his fingers along the grain of the polymer and steel, feeling for the little ghosts others missed. If he judged it worthy a weapon that still had work left in it, a chance to serve, he would simply draw it closer to his lamp and begin. He was not there to save every rifle, but he never left one that could be saved. Something else had shifted too, something subtler and more hopeful. The younger technicians began to drift by Maddox's bench during their breaks, at first pretending to be busy with their own projects. In time, they came openly standing a respectful distance away, notebooks in hand, or just watching with quiet, intense interest. They didn't come for lectures. They never asked for a lesson plan or a seminar. Instead, they tried to decipher what set Maddox apart. "How do you know it's off-center without tearing the whole thing down?" one asked Harris, another junior tech, after watching Maddox for half a shift. Harris just shrugged. "You watch. You pay attention to what his hands are doing. Sometimes he gives you a tool and doesn't say a word about it. You figure it out. Or you don't." Occasionally, Maddox would hand a cold chisel or a tiny punch to a nearby apprentice, never explaining its purpose. If the recipient fumbled or used it incorrectly, Maddox would quietly take it back and say nothing. If they figured it out, he'd give a slight nod, then move on. Word spread. He's not teaching a trade. He's teaching you to see the rifle the way he does, as if it's a living thing at the edge of dying, and your job is to understand, not just to fix. No lectures, no diagrams, no official training sessions. But slowly, the way the armory worked began to change. People checked parts by hand, listened for new noises, and didn't rely only on readouts. The culture of the shop, once loud, rushed, and impatient, grew a little quieter, more deliberate. No one said I learned from Maddox. That would have seemed like claiming too much. Instead, when the subject came up, the young techs just said, "I was there the day Maddox worked on Jackson's HK." That was enough. One Friday, as the sun sank behind the ridge, Maddox finished resetting the barrel pressure on a battered sniper rifle. The armory was half empty. Most of the team had clocked out. A young soldier named Callahan lingered near the door, then doubled back. He waited as Maddox wiped the last streaks of oil from the weapon's bolt. Sir Callahan asked hesitantly, "Why don't you teach? I mean, with your skill, you could run circles around half the instructors at Crane or Benning." Maddox didn't look up. He seated the bolt, spun a screw with patient fingers, and finally replied, "I'm not here to teach. I'm here to make amends." Callahan said nothing more. A couple of other techs, those who'd overheard, paused mid-task. They glanced at each other, then at Maddox, then looked away. There was nothing more to say. It was suddenly clear in that brief silence that he wasn't after recognition or legacy. He didn't want to leave his name in the system or have a class of disciples. He needed only the gun in front of him, the clean morning light, and the soft click of metal mended beneath his hands. Maddox never spoke of Fallujah, not to anyone, but sometimes a gun would come across his bench with the same troubling symptoms: a faint shift in cycle, a whiff of suppressed back pressure, the memory of a failure that had cost too much too long ago. He worked on those rifles with a concentration that bordered on reverence, as if repairing not just metal, but something far older, heavier, and more sacred. Now and then, a tech would blurt out, "How'd you know the suppressor would mess up the gas?" After the third burst, Maddox might answer, "I've seen it before." He never elaborated, never said, "I watched men die because of this." He didn't need to. Every bead of solder, every precisely set spring, every torque value on a reinstalled barrel carried the weight of things lost and never spoken of. For Maddox, armory work was no longer just a profession. It was a kind of silent requiem, each rifle laid to rest and brought back again, a mute funeral for names he couldn't say aloud. Every morning he came, not to make a living, but to keep memory alive. Each gun restored was like incense burned in memory, a private ritual, a penance he could never complete. No one at Redstone ever asked Maddox to become an official mentor. No one tried to make him lead the new recruits or run training for the whole unit. They knew better. Anyone who tried to force him into a teacher's role would watch him grow quiet, maybe even vanish from the armory for a day or two. So instead, they simply let him be. When a particularly vexing problem arose, a rifle with temperamental balance, a carbine whose grouping kept drifting off zero no matter how many times it was serviced, the team handed it off to Maddox. Not with ceremony, but with the respect reserved for a heart surgeon prepping for a high-risk operation. One time an army captain gave his men a clear order. If Maddox fixes your rifle, don't thank him. Just use it right. That was the only bond Maddox needed to know. That somewhere out there someone might have a fighting chance because of what he'd rebuilt with his own hands. He didn't want his picture on the wall or his name in the armory newsletter. His legacy wasn't in headlines, but in every weapon that left his bench quietly restored and ready for whatever came next. In the end, no one could say how many rifles Maddox had brought back to life, but the evidence of his presence was everywhere. In the careful silence with which the team now worked, in the extra minute a young tech spent checking an extractor, in the hush that fell when a really difficult case landed on Maddox's table. If you listened, you could almost hear it, the breath held in the moment. A gun cycled perfectly after weeks of failing, the faint sigh of metal as it found its proper place. The silent gratitude that was never voiced, but always present. Maddox's redemption wasn't something he ever spoke of or claimed for himself. It was a living thing existing in the space between his hands, in the broken machine, in the respectful distance others now kept, in the absence of praise or reward. He atoned not with words, but with each act of care, turning a wrench, winding a spring, setting a pin. The soul of his work was not glory, but the hope that this time no one would pay the price for a failure he could have prevented. In this, the others let him continue, not out of pity, but of recognition. They saw in Maddox not a hero, not even a mentor, but the final witness to a standard that could not be taught or measured. If a rifle needed saving, he would do it. If a soul needed saving, perhaps he'd done all he could. There were no photographs of Maddox. No one wrote an article about him. But his presence was in the air, in the shift of every trigger, the patience in every adjustment, the silent wisdom in every tool mark. In Redstone, that was enough. His legacy unspoken lived on in every act of redemption, remade not by apology, but by the careful, invisible work of a man who'd chosen to atone one part at a time.
Thank you for staying with us until the end of this story. We'd love to hear from you. Share your thoughts in the comments below and let us know your favorite part. If you enjoyed the journey, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more captivating stories like this one. And don't miss out. Hit the notification bell so you're always updated on our latest content. Your support truly means the world to us.